The glass walls of the Grand Meridian Hotel gleamed under the early afternoon sun, reflecting the endless buzz of the city outside. Inside, the air was thick with power suits, hushed conversations, and the faint clink of crystal glasses. This wasn't just any business conference. It was the event of the year, where the nation's wealthiest and most influential gathered to discuss the future of global trade. Ethan Cole, the 38-year-old CEO of Cole Enterprises, strode through the hallway with the kind of commanding presence that made heads turn. His dark tailored suit fit him perfectly. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, and his phone was glued to his ear as he spoke to his board of directors in his usual clipped, decisive tone. Ethan wasn't just successful. He was the definition of untouchable. The media called him the man who turned everything to gold. But to those who knew him, he was colder than the steel towers his company built across cities. But at that moment, even men like Ethan were still human. His morning coffee had long worn off, his head was pounding from endless negotiations, and his patience was frayed by yet another demand from shareholders. He needed a break, just 5 minutes to breathe. So when he spotted the restroom sign at the end of the corridor, he made a beeline for it. Barely glancing up from his phone, he pushed open the door with the same haste he handled everything in life. The faint scent of lavender struck him first, oddly soft compared to the usual sterile air of men's restrooms. But Ethan didn't notice, not yet. His phone call ended abruptly with a curt, "Handle it. I don't care how." He slipped the device into his pocket, rubbed his temples, and only then did he hear it. The sharp clack of heaving against the tiled floor. Confused, he froze. He looked up and his eyes darted around the room. Soft lighting. Pink marbled counters. A small bouquet of fresh roses in a vase by the mirror. This isn't the men's room. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole, the man known for his flawless composure, felt heat crawl up his neck. He had walked straight into the women's restroom. He muttered under his breath, "Great. Just what I needed." Turning swiftly toward the door, he reached for the handle, eager to escape unnoticed. But then, he heard it, a faint sound, so soft he almost dismissed it as imagination, a muffled, shaky breath, followed by the undeniable catch of a sob. Ethan stopped, his brows furrowed as he tilted his head slightly. Listening. It wasn't coming from the entrance or the vanity area, it was deeper inside, behind one of the closed stalls. Another sob followed, fragile and broken. Like the sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard. Ethan's instinct was to leave. This wasn't his business. He was already in the wrong place. If anyone saw him, it would be scandalous. But something about the sound rooted him to the spot. It wasn't just sadness, it was desperation, the kind that clawed at you, that pulled you in whether you wanted to be involved or not. He cleared his throat, debating with himself. Then, against every logical thought screaming in his head, he took a hesitant step closer. "Hello." His voice, deep and commanding, echoed slightly in the tiled room. "Is someone in there?" There was silence. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it all, but then, the faint sound of movement inside the stall, followed by a trembling whisper, "Please. Just go. Don't call anyone." Ethan froze. The voice was young female, and laced with fear. His first instinct was to retreat, to give her privacy, but something in her tone, pleading, fragile, almost resigned, stirred something unfamiliar in him. For a man used to negotiating billion-dollar deals without blinking, Ethan suddenly felt uncertain. He glanced at the door again. He could walk out, pretend this never happened, return to his world of contracts and mergers. But as he stood there, in the lavender-scented quiet of a women's restroom, he realized he couldn't. Something was very wrong. And Ethan Cole, the man who claimed he never got involved in anyone's mess, was about to step into one that would change everything. Ethan stood in the middle of the restroom, frozen between two choices. Leave quietly, or acknowledge the broken voice behind the stall door. His whole life had been about control, precision, and never straying outside the lines. But this moment was different. The sobs weren't just background noise. They pulled at something deep inside him, something he thought he'd buried years ago. He took a slow step forward. His polished shoes echoed against the tiles. His reflection catching in the spotless mirror, as though even his own image was cautioning him. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Ethan said carefully, keeping his voice low and calm. I just heard you. Are you alright? There was a long pause, broken only by her uneven breathing. Then, hesitantly, came the reply, please, don't tell anyone I'm here. The fragility in her tone startled him. She didn't sound like someone who had simply slipped away for a moment of privacy. She sounded like someone hiding from the world. Ethan hesitated, then leaned slightly toward the closed stall, lowering his voice to something softer than he even recognized. I won't tell anyone, he promised. But it doesn't sound like you're okay. Inside, there was a rustle of fabric, the faint sound of someone shifting uncomfortably. Then, with a shaky sigh, she spoke again. I fainted earlier. My manager told me to take a break, but I didn't want to go back out. I didn't want anyone to see me like this. Ethan's brow furrowed. He could picture it now, someone young, overworked, trying to hide their weakness. He'd seen it before. Though usually in his employees who pushed themselves to meet his impossible deadlines. But there was something different in her voice. This wasn't the strain of ambition. This was survival. He leaned lightly against the partition, his tone still measured. Did you eat anything today? The question hung in the air. A pause, then, almost inaudibly, no. Not really. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That single admission carried the weight of truth he couldn't ignore. Hunger, exhaustion, desperation. He had grown up with a mother who skipped meals so he and his brother could eat. It was a memory he rarely let surface. But the sound of this young woman's voice cracked the armor around it. Look, he said after a moment, adjusting his tie though no one could see him. You shouldn't be alone if you're feeling faint. I have some water. And a protein bar, I think. He unzipped his sleek leather briefcase and fished through the side compartment, pulling out the items he always carried during long business days. He crouched slightly, setting them on the tiled floor outside the stall. You can take these, he added quietly. I'll step back. Silence. Then, after a few tense seconds, the stall door cracked open just enough for a hand to appear, thin, trembling and pale. She quickly snatched the water bottle and bar, retreating inside again as though afraid of being seen. Ethan waited, listening. A faint click of the bottle opening, a long gulp, the sound of the wrapper being torn. He should have walked away, this wasn't his problem. But instead, he found himself asking, what's your name? Another pause. Then, reluctantly, Clara, Clara, he repeated softly, almost to himself. The name was delicate, like the voice behind the door. And you work here? I work, everywhere, she said bitterly between bites. The cafe downstairs, the night shift at the laundromat across the street. Anywhere that'll pay me enough to keep the lights on. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a tired employee. It was someone barely holding her life together. He had walked in expecting to wash his hands and escape back into the world of suits and negotiations. But instead, he'd stumbled upon a human reality he hadn't faced in years. You said you fainted. Ethan pressed gently. That's not something to ignore. Do you have anyone to call? Her reply was quick, almost defensive. No. I can handle it, I always do. Ethan let the silence settle. He could hear her shallow breaths, the way she was forcing strength into them as if trying to convince both him and herself. Finally, her voice cracked. Betraying the truth she had tried to bury, my mom's in the hospital. The bills, they're more than I can handle. I can't afford to get sick. If I stop working, she doesn't get treatment. That's why I can't let anyone see me like this. I can't lose my job. The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He knew the weight of responsibility, of carrying others' futures on your shoulders, but he had millions in the bank, a private jet waiting at the airport. She had nothing but her own two hands and a heart that refused to quit. For the first time in years, he found himself speechless. And in that quiet restroom, surrounded by luxury tiles and lavender air, Ethan Cole, Millionaire CEO, untouchable businessman, realized he was standing on the threshold of something that wasn't business at all. It was humanity. The restroom was silent except for the faint sound of Clara sipping water and the soft crinkle of the protein bar wrapper. Ethan stood a few feet away from the stall door, his tall frame stiff against the pristine marble wall, his mind a storm of thoughts. He wasn't supposed to be here. A man of his status had no business lingering in a women's restroom. much less offering food to a stranger he'd accidentally stumbled upon. If anyone saw him, the tabloids would eat it alive. Millionaire, CEO caught in women's restroom scandal. His shareholders would panic. His board would demand explanations. His enemies would laugh. And yet none of that seemed to matter right now. For the first time in years, Ethan's mind wasn't filled with quarterly reports or international mergers. It was focused entirely on the trembling voice behind that stall door. He cleared his throat lightly. "Clara, are you feeling any better?" There was hesitation, then a soft murmur. "Little. Thank you for the water." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He was a man used to closing deals with stone-faced executives, but for some reason, speaking to Clara required a gentleness he hadn't practiced in years. "You shouldn't have to hide," he said quietly. "Not for being tired. Not for fainting." The stall door creaked slightly as if she'd leaned her head against it. "Easy for you to say. People like me don't get second chances. If my manager finds out I collapsed again, I'll lose this job. And then my mom." Her voice broke, dissolving into a shaky breath she tried desperately to hide. Ethan's chest tightened. He had no idea what compelled him. But his feet carried him closer until he was standing right in front of the stall. He hesitated only a moment before speaking, his tone low but steady. "I'm not your manager. I'm not going to fire you. And I'm not going to walk away, either." There was silence. Then slowly the stall door opened a fraction, revealing a sliver of Clara's face. Ethan caught his first glimpse of her. Young, maybe mid-20s. With tired eyes shadowed by dark circles. Strands of her hair had slipped from the bun tied hastily at the back of her head. Her cafe uniform was slightly wrinkled, a name tag hanging loosely from the pocket. She looked worn down, fragile even, but there was something else there too. An unmistakable resilience, like a candle still burning in a storm. Her wide eyes flickered with shock when she realized who she was looking at. Ethan Cole's face was plastered across business magazines' screens in Times Square, financial news channels. He was impossible not to recognize. Her lips parted slightly. You're him. The CEO. The billionaire." Ethan felt the familiar weight of the title, one he had worn like armor for years. But standing there under her tired gaze, it felt hollow. "I'm just Ethan right now," he said quietly. Clara blinked, as if unsure whether to believe him. "Why are you even talking to me?" The question struck deeper than he expected. Why was he? He could have walked away, pretended none of this happened. But he hadn't, and he realized, almost uncomfortably, that he didn't want to. "Because you're not okay," he admitted. The words surprised even him. "And I can't ignore that." For a long moment, Clara just stared at him through the crack in the door, her expression caught between suspicion and disbelief. Then, slowly, she pushed the door open wider and stepped out. Up close, she looked even smaller. Her cafe apron hanging loosely from her frame, her hands clutching the half-empty water bottle like it was a lifeline. Ethan noticed the way she tried to square her shoulders, to appear stronger than she felt. That quiet determination stirred something in him. Something he hadn't let himself feel since his younger days, before the money, before the empire. She lowered her gaze quickly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to see this. It's humiliating." Ethan shook his head. "No, it's human." The words slipped out before he could stop them, but they were true. And he realized how rare it was for him to even acknowledge humanity anymore. His world was built on numbers, strategies, and profits. But Clara reminded him of the world outside boardrooms. The world where people worked themselves to exhaustion just to keep loved ones alive. Clara swallowed hard, shifting on her feet. I can't afford to be weak. Not now. Not ever." Ethan studied her carefully. Her words carried the weight of a life that never allowed her rest, of battles fought in silence. He remembered nights from his own childhood, when his mother would stay awake sewing clothes, long after he and his brother were asleep, pretending she wasn't hungry, insisting she had already eaten. He hadn't thought about those days in years. Looking at Clara now, it was like seeing a reflection of the past he'd buried under wealth and power. Without realizing it, his tone softened. "You're not weak. You're stronger than most people I know. Stronger than half the executives I deal with every day." The Clara's eyes flickered up to his, surprised. And for the first time, Ethan saw something shift in her expression, just a flicker of trust, fragile but real. She let out a breath, shaky but lighter than before. "You don't mean that." "I do," Ethan said firmly. "And I think it's time someone else told you." For a man who built his empire on contracts and logic, Ethan Cole couldn't explain what was happening inside him. All he knew was that the walls he had spent years constructing around himself were beginning to crack. And it was this young, exhausted woman, standing in a restroom with trembling hands and unbreakable spirit, who had done it. For the first time in a long, long while, Ethan didn't feel like the CEO of Cole Enterprises. He just felt human. Ethan guided Clara gently toward the vanity area, careful to keep a respectful distance. She looked uneasy being outside the stall, but he could tell standing was an act of courage for her. The fluorescent lights above revealed more than she likely wanted anyone to see. The paleness of her skin, the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. Clara tried to pull her apron tighter around her, as if to hide the vulnerability she carried. "You don't need to waste your time here," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm fine now. Really." Ethan leaned against the counter, folding his arms across his chest. His suit jacket caught the light, its sharp tailoring a stark contrast to her wrinkled uniform. To anyone else, it might have looked like two different worlds colliding in one room, and maybe that's exactly what it was. "You don't look fine," he replied, his tone steady but not unkind. "And I've learned to trust appearances less than words." Clara let out a small, humorless laugh. "Of course you'd say that. You live in a world where appearances are everything." Her words hit harder than she probably intended. Ethan didn't flinch, but something stirred inside him. She wasn't wrong. For years, his life had been about pristine presentations, flawless deals, the mask of absolute control. But looking at her now, stripped of pretense, he realized how exhausting that mask had always been. Clara sank onto a small bench near the wall, clutching the water bottle in her lap. She hesitated, as if debating whether to speak at all, then finally whispered, "Do you know why I was hiding here? Why I couldn't let anyone see me?" Ethan stayed quiet, waiting. "My manager doesn't tolerate weakness," she said after a pause. "Last month one of the girls fainted during a shift. He fired her on the spot. Said she was unreliable. I can't," her voice broke, but she pushed on. "I can't lose this job. Not when my mom's treatment depends on it." Ethan's chest tightened. He had heard stories like this in passing, whispers about overworked staff in service industries. But to see it in front of him, to hear it so plainly, was different. It wasn't just a statistic. It was Clara. She bit her lip, twisting the cap of the bottle nervously. "My mom was a nurse. She gave everything she had to help people, even when it meant ignoring her own health. Last year, she collapsed at work. Stage 3 cancer. And now," Clara shook her head, her voice trembling, "now it's all on me. Rent, bills, food, hospital costs. My younger brother and sister, they still think I can fix everything. I can't let them down." Her words spilled out like a dam breaking, raw and unpolished. Ethan listened in silence, his throat tightening. He saw her not as the exhausted cafe worker she appeared to be, but as a daughter, a sister, a protector fighting battles no one else could see. "I was in school," Clara continued, her voice quieter now. "Nursing program. I wanted to be like her. But when she got sick, tuition had to go. Dreams had to go. None of it matters when you're just trying to survive." She looked up then, and her eyes locked with his. They were tired eyes, yes, but also defiant. Eyes that refused to surrender, even when the world demanded it. Ethan felt something shift inside him, an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He remembered his own mother working double shifts at a diner, when he was a boy, sewing clothes late into the night just to keep food on the table. He remembered the way she smiled through her exhaustion, insisting they'd be okay, even when the rent was overdue and the cupboards were bare. He had buried those memories beneath skyscrapers and boardrooms, telling himself he'd escaped that life. But Clara's story brought them back with brutal clarity. "You shouldn't have to carry all of this alone," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. Clara gave a small, bitter smile. "That's what everyone says when they find out. But no one actually helps. Not really. People mean well, but at the end of the day, It's just me and my paycheck keeping everything afloat. And if I fall. She trailed off, shaking her head. There's no safety net. Ethan studied her, the weight of her words pressing against him like a physical force. He had spent years building safety nets for corporations, contingency plans, financial buffers, golden parachutes. But here was Clara, a single young woman, carrying the weight of an entire family without any of those protections. He swallowed hard, realizing that despite all his billions, she was the stronger one. She faced the world head-on every day, with no shield but her determination. You said you wanted to be a nurse. Ethan murmured after a long silence. Clara's eyes softened, a flicker of longing breaking through her exhaustion. I did. I still do. But some dreams aren't meant for people like me. Ethan straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than profit margins stirring in him. Anger. Not at Clara, but at a world that let someone like her believe she didn't deserve to dream. Clara, unaware of the storm inside him, rose to her feet slowly. She adjusted her apron, trying to compose herself, as if bracing to step back into the role the world demanded of her. The invisible worker, the girl who couldn't afford weakness. Thank you. She said softly, her voice steadying again. For the water. For listening. You don't owe me anything, so you should go. Pretend this never happened. Ethan couldn't pretend. Not anymore. He watched her, this fragile yet unbreakable woman, and realized she had stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility. Not the kind that came with contracts and empires, but the kind that came with being human. And as Clara turned toward the door, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty: walking away was no longer an option. Clara moved toward the restroom door, her steps slow but steady, as though she'd patched together just enough strength to face the world outside again. Ethan remained by the vanity, unmoving, his sharp reflection staring back at him in the mirror. For once, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He had built a life out of walking away from problems that weren't his, a life where emotions were a liability and compassion was a distraction. But now, as Clara's trembling hand reached for the handle, he knew this was the moment he either lived by that cold creed, or broke it. Clara. His voice stopped her instantly. She turned, her tired eyes searching his face. Uncertain. Yes. Ethan took a step closer. His tailored suit, his polished shoes, his aura of wealth and authority. None of it seemed to matter now. What mattered was the weight in his chest. The undeniable pull to do something he had never done before: step into someone else's suffering, not as a CEO, but as a man. You said your mother's treatment depends on you keeping this job. He paused, steadying his tone. What hospital is she in? Clara blinked, caught off guard. Why do you ask? Because. Ethan said firmly, she's not going to go without treatment. Not anymore. I'll cover her bills. Every last one of them. Clara froze, her mouth opening slightly in shock. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then she shook her head quickly. Almost angrily. No, I can't accept that. You don't even know me. I don't need charity. Her voice cracked on the last word, a mix of pride and fear. Ethan admired her resistance even as it pained him. He understood. Accepting help often felt like admitting defeat. But he also knew she had been fighting alone for too long. This isn't charity, he said quietly, taking another step toward her. It's an investment. Not in a business. In you. The Clara stared at him, bewildered. In me, yes, Ethan replied without hesitation. You're stronger than most people I've ever met. You've sacrificed everything for your family, and you still dream of helping others. That's not weakness. That's resilience. And it's exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. Her lips trembled. Her eyes shimmering with disbelief. Why? I don't understand. Why would a man like you care about someone like me? Ethan drew in a slow breath. It was a question he wasn't sure he could fully answer. But he spoke from the raw place inside him, that had been woken for the first time in years. Because once, a long time ago, I was in your shoes. My mother worked herself to the bone to give me a chance. I swore I'd never forget what she gave up for me. And yet I did, until today you reminded me. Clara covered her mouth with her hand, tears threatening to spill. Ethan stepped closer still. His voice steady but filled with conviction. You wanted to be a nurse. You still can. I have a foundation, one that funds education and medical training. I'll put you in the program. You'll get your degree. And your family will be taken care of. No more night shifts, no more hiding in restrooms. You'll finally be able to breathe again. The words hung between them, heavy and life-altering. Clara's hand dropped slowly from her lips, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. This feels like a dream. People like me don't just get rescued by people like you. Ethan's gaze softened. Maybe it's not about rescue. Maybe it's about doors, she echoed. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. I walked into the wrong door today, Clara. And maybe it was exactly the right one. Sometimes the wrong doors lead us where we're meant to be. Clara let out a shaky laugh. A sound that was part disbelief and part release of everything she'd been holding in. The tears she had tried to swallow finally spilled over, streaking down her cheeks as she whispered. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Ethan said simply. Just promise me one thing. Don't give up on yourself. The world already tried to take enough from you. Don't let it take your dreams too. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Clara nodded. Her hands tightened around the water bottle, not as a crutch, but as if anchoring herself to this moment of unexpected hope. Okay, she whispered. I promise. Ethan felt something shift deep within him, a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. For once, this wasn't about profit margins or market strategies. This was about doing what his wealth was meant to do. Change lives. As they stepped out of the restroom together, Ethan discreetly motioned to one of his assistants waiting in the corridor. He gave quick, quiet instructions: contact the hospital, settle the bills, begin the paperwork for Clara's scholarship. Clara walked beside him. Her steps still tentative, but for the first time since he'd met her, her shoulders weren't hunched under invisible weight. There was a faint light in her eyes now. A spark of possibility. And Ethan knew. As they walked into the bustling hotel corridor, filled with suits and polished shoes, that his life had changed too. Because sometimes, the most powerful decisions weren't made in boardrooms. They were made by listening to a stranger cry behind a restroom stall, and choosing to care.